Hi, Stitchers. Welcome to Tatreez Talk, where we share conversations about Palestinian embroidery. I'm Amani here with my co-host Lena, chatting with talented embroiderers and artists sharing their stories, inspirations, and the cultural significance behind their work.
On today's episode, we're chatting with Najla, an environmental activist, creator, and the founder of Zero Waste Palestine. Welcome to Tatreez Talk, Najla.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Amazing, amazing. And Najla and I have actually been in touch for a minute. So I'm so excited to talk about some certain intersectionalities between Tatreez and other parts of things that we should be thinking about. But Najla, typically when we start these episodes, we like to learn more from you about you and your family's connection to Palestine. Would you mind sharing a bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Najla and I'm Swedish Palestinian. So I was born from a Swedish mother and a Palestinian father, and grew up in Jerusalem most of my upbringing. And so my connection to Palestine is basically a lot about Jerusalem and my childhood there. And yeah, everything about Jerusalem, basically. And in recent years, like as an adult, I started being exposed to other parts of Palestine as I got more independent and was able to travel alone myself. So I've been a lot to Ramallah, for example, Bethlehem. Those are usually the places that I spend a lot of time in. So I feel even though I'm biologically half Palestinian by blood, I still feel fully Palestinian when it comes to my identity, basically.
Mm-hmm. Can I be the nosy one and ask, how did your parents meet?
Yeah, so my mom came to Palestine with her choir during the first Intifada. And during that time, my dad was working as a tour guide where he was taking journalists, activists, and politicians to show them different parts of Palestine, but from a Palestinian perspective. So taking them to refugee camps, to visit parents of prisoners and martyrs and so on. So he was their tour guide, and she fell in love with him. And 3 years later, they got married, and in Jerusalem. So they spent. That's why I spent most of my upbringing here in Palestine.
That's so cute. I know we all the rom-com of like meeting the love of your life while you're on vacation, and I guess your mom did that, and I love that. It's so cute.
Yeah, it's a nice love story.
That's amazing, Najla. And so your mom stays in Jerusalem as well with you, or do you now travel frequently to Sweden and back?
I travel a lot between Palestine and Sweden, since I have some work in Sweden as well. But my project is based in Palestine and in the region, so I spend a lot of time here as well. So it's a lot of back and forth, I would say.
I'm curious to ask you, like, obviously you grew up in Palestine, and obviously were clearly like immersed in every aspect of Palestinian culture growing up there. But you also have this Swedish heritage. And I know in Sweden there is, in Scandinavia in general, there is this like beautiful history of embroidery as well. And I know we haven't got into the Tatreez yet, but I'm just curious how your Swedish heritage and your Swedish culture has kind of intertwined with your Palestinian identity as well. And what does that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because actually the person who taught me stitch embroidery is my Swedish grandmother. And it's done in exactly the same way as the Palestinian Tatreez, but it's just like not the same patterns and it's done in different ways.
Yeah.
And also my mom, she preserves a lot of her ancestors' this stuff and cloths and like different pieces of textile and clothing and so on. So I have been exposed to embroidery most of my upbringing from both cultures. So yeah, I feel that I haven't really been aware of it from that sense. It's only until recent years when I became more aware of Tatreez as a form of how important it is to preserve Palestinian identity and Palestinianness, that I've started somehow to connect the dots more. But yeah, there's definitely similarities from both cultures, and I think there's embroidery in many cultures around the world. It's just that it's done in different ways. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, so you're actually our first guest who doesn't practice Tatreez. But we know that you appreciate it, you enjoy wearing it, you find it beautiful, etc. So I'm curious about your relationship specifically with Tatreez. So how did you first get introduced to it? How do you engage with Tatreez as someone who doesn't practice? And we will definitely ask you later why you haven't started practicing.
Yeah, so as I grew up in Jerusalem, I've always been exposed to Tatreez. Like, we always used to have it at home, or we still have it at home, like, but mostly in cushions, like this cushion, for example. So it's always present in our household, in furniture pieces, and also like seeing women in different festivities, sometimes wearing different forms of Tatreez. So yeah, that's it's kind of been like a natural part of rule as a Palestinian growing up in Palestine. And I always used to connect it to something that is quite expensive, because yeah, that was kind of my idea of it, that if you're able to buy Tatreez, I mean, usually in the markets where the women used to sell Tatreez that we used to go to, it was quite expensive. So I was always relating it to something quite costly and valuable.
That's so interesting, because a lot of people, like, I think about people like my dad, for example, who went to Ramallah like 25 years ago or something, and he did buy a couple of pillows, but he tells me how in that experience, his goal was to negotiate as low of a price as possible. And in my mind, like, the way he had described it was that it shouldn't be so expensive. It should be cheaper. And I think as he's experienced me and witnessed me doing Tatreez, he's grown to appreciate and value it at a higher price monetarily for the amount of work that goes into it. So that's really interesting. I'm curious to know, like, how is that just something that you were just like thinking about, or was it something also that your parents instilled in terms of like this being a highly valued item?
So in the city of Jerusalem, Tatreez is not really a thing. Historically, women did not used to like wear the thobe as much as they did in the different villages in different parts of Palestine. So it's not a Jerusalemite thing to wear a thobe, for example, but there's still Tatreez. They still engaged in some like Tatreez during. That's what I've heard, at least. So they have it in as pieces of furniture in the household and so on. And I think that idea of it being expensive came from my parents, because I heard them talking about how expensive it is to buy, pieces of Tatreez from the different markets or shops that you used to go to. So, and especially if it's like handmade Tatreez, it's one of the most, expensive things that you can buy. And also in the old city of Jerusalem, when you go into the shops there, there's several shops that sell secondhand, like old pieces of handmade thobes and Tatreez, and those are usually quite expensive. Some even cost like thousands of dollars. So that's my idea of like why it is an expensive and quite inaccessible thing to many.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so Lena mentioned that you are our first guest who does not Tatreez. And that leads us to ask, what has stopped you from picking up the needle and thread and making your own Tatreez art?
I think that it's not typical thing that people do, especially in my surroundings. I like none of my friends or cousins or either older relatives, they never engage in Tatreez or do Tatreez. So I felt it's something that is usually connected to, for example, older ladies in maybe more remote areas or in smaller villages that is something for them. So I never really thought about doing it. I never really thought that it was something that I should do or supposed to. I wasn't really conscious about it. But actually, like recently, I started becoming more seeing people, being exposed to people my age and in our generation that are engaging in this artwork inspired me to, yeah, it made me think that like why not? Like it's definitely it's a beautiful thing, and it's so important to also preserve this art as much as possible. And also seeing Lina like coming out with her classes even gave me more inspiration to do that, because I feel that you help people do it in a very like easy easy way. So if you lower the barriers of entry, I guess, to start. So yeah, I'm definitely inspired to start at least. I know.
I can relate to what you were saying though earlier about like it, I feel like there was a time, and before I started personally engaging with Tatreez, like it was kind of viewed as like, oh, this is what like the hijab do. This is like old lady, like, who's really doing Tatreez. Um,
Mm.
and that was for sure for me, like kind of something that kept me away until I personally just decided, let me just try this and cultivated my own style. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you can, what you wind up cultivating when you do, pick up your needle and thread. And it sounds like, you have a history of it from your Swedish side. So it should come very naturally.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I would love to, definitely. It's also a matter of time. Like I also associate it to something that is very time consuming, and that is usually something that I like. But I also feel that it is a very meditative thing to do. So it's very healthy, I guess, in many aspects.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up so many, I guess, like not necessarily myths, but things that people think about that are not necessarily, they don't have to necessarily be true. So like one is that this is associated with like something that you do when you're much older. Another one is that you need time. And like, yes, it is a very time consuming art form when you think about different sizes of pieces that you want to do. But what I found, at least for myself, and hopefully this like helps our listeners as well think about it a little bit more, is I actually sometimes will only stitch for like 15 minutes a day. And you'd be so surprised how like far along your project, comes. It's more a bit about just like that initial, it is a little bit of practice at the very beginning that maybe takes up a lot more time and is the hardest to overcome. But I think what's interesting about Tatreez is you can just take it wherever you go. It's easy to just get like sucked into it whenever you're stressed out in a day, or like take a break from all the things that are going on in the world. I know for me, especially during the last 9 months in particular, it's been a godsend to have Tatreez as a little bit of a place where I can just kind of have solace and find peace in. So I'm so happy you're bringing these things up though, because I think a lot of people feel this way, and it's a lot of the perception of Tatreez that I think hopefully this podcast and other forms of engaging with Tatreez can help help people overcome.
And I would just also say, like, I'm a little bit different from Nina in the sense where I don't necessarily have time to stitch every day. Sometimes I go stretches without having time to stitch. But when I do have my time, I kind of just zone out and do the thing. And I say that to say that, like, everyone has a different flow. And I think the key is not to put pressure on yourself. Like, do not stress
Mm.
yourself about timelines, because you could do projects that are like small that can be done in like one sitting, or you could be someone like me that does these like large projects that can take me 9 months to do, but I don't really care. I'm not in a rush. I'm not on a deadline. So it's like, it's definitely a lesson in a lesson in not being hard on yourself and
Yeah.
and putting more pressure than you need to.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think all of these are just excuses. Time is usually an excuse that many people have to prevent them from doing many things. But yeah, as long as there's a will and inspiration, it could definitely be done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Najla, I know that one of the reasons that I really wanted to bring you onto the podcast is because of your work with Zero Waste Palestine. So just to kick us off on like gearing towards that part of the conversation, could you tell our listeners a little bit about what Zero Waste Palestine is? And then like where does that work intersect with Tatreez? Because I think there's very much a huge opportunity to kind of discuss that intersection.
Yeah. Zero Waste Palestine is an initiative that I started more than 6 years ago. It started as a simple blog on WordPress, and it resulted as a reaction or as a result of a frustration that I felt towards the waste crisis in many parts of Palestine and the Middle East, like the region in general, that there is, really a waste crisis. There's also a lack of awareness about environmental related issue due to the lack of prioritization for these issues, for obvious reasons, because of the challenges that exist in the day-to-day life, which makes environmental topics deprioritized, and that's completely understandable. But I felt that it gave me some form of anxiety to see these piles of waste, and also knowing that I was contributing to that. So like a while back, or a bit before that, I became aware of the zero waste philosophy or lifestyle, that people around the world are practicing this kind of lifestyle in order to reduce their waste and trash footprint, to decrease their impacts, negative impact on the environment. So I felt that I wanted to create this blog to spread the message of that it is possible to reduce waste, despite living in a context where this issue is not prioritized and where the infrastructure does not help with recycling infrastructure or proper waste management systems and so on. And I also love photography, so I thought that it was a good idea, or a good way of getting some photos out to the world while also creating a good message. And with time that developed, so it went from being a blog to I started engaging more in like physical learning activities. So going and talking to students in schools and universities, sometimes to teachers, employees in different places, to talk about what I was doing and why I was doing it and so on. And yeah, a couple of years ago, I became more engaged with social media, creating digital content, and on Instagram mostly. And yeah, now I'm focused both on content creation, but also on creating physical learning experiences to increase the awareness related to environmental topics and specifically waste topics. So these physical learning experiences are both through retreats, summits, summer schools, workshops, and so on. And I love the idea of bringing people together and making them feel that they're part of, something bigger, a collective. And it's through these connections that are creating in these physical learning experiences that co-creation and co-learning can happen in a nice way. And yeah, as part of my lifestyle is that I do not consume new things or buy new things. For example, clothing is something that I do not consume as new, because the fashion industry is, one of the most polluting industries in the world. And there's a huge, both environmental, social, and ethical negative impacts resulting from the fashion industry, specifically fast fashion. So that is not something that I want to contribute to this, endless consumption pattern. So that's why I engage in slow fashion practices, like wearing what I already have, buying secondhand, borrowing, making my own, or mending and stuff like that. So that's where Tatreez comes in, because it's a typical example of slow fashion. Because Tatreez, first it's a form of artwork, and it takes so much time and energy to do and to create. So it's a typical form of, especially if it's handmade, of course, not the commercial ones. So that's a typical form of a way of practicing slow fashion, because you start you value the piece, because you know how much time and energy is put into it. So yeah, there's a clear intersection between Tatreez and sustainability in that sense.
And can you just, for listeners who don't know, can you elaborate a little bit on what fast fashion is as opposed to slow fashion, which you touched on?
Fast fashion is the idea of endless consumption and endless, producing clothes in a very fast pace. So all these big brands, big fashion brands, and that are producing clothes in a way that makes them maximize their profits. So they come out with, all these new clothing all the time, pushing new collections to the market. And it's a way of also marketing the clothes, like bringing the prices down to make the people buy more and more. And by being able to sell clothes so cheaply means that they are also produced in a very cheap manner. So when you look at how the clothes are produced, it has a huge toll on the environment, of course, but also the people that are making them, who mostly have terrible working conditions, very bad salaries and wages, and many people are suffering from illnesses and diseases. Some even die because of the bad working conditions in these fashion or textile factories that produce clothes for the big fashion brands. So this is the idea of fast fashion. So consuming more and producing more in a very fast cycle somehow. Slow fashion is the opposite of fast fashion. So it's about producing clothes in a very conscious way, knowing where the materials and clothing, materials come from, knowing how they are produced, and that they are produced in a very ethical way, and not having a business or a way of producing that is, based on endless growth and endless production, but is actually, producing pieces in a conscious manner. And and they usually are more expensive than fast fashion brands, because the workers are paid fairly, as opposed to fast fashion.
Yeah, you're making me now think about how I view clothing ever since I did start doing Tatreez, and more specifically making my thobe. So Tatreez in particular made me value handmade embroidery, but making my thobe really made me think about my closet a lot more. And I noticed that ever since I started that project, I don't really buy as much. I look to wear the things that I have in my closet a lot more frequently. And you're making me now think a little bit about how I value clothing from a monetary, a financial perspective. So for example, I was just thinking about this as you were talking. I was doing the mental math. When I associate a price to, let's say, a handmade thobe that I buy, and I think about all the different times that I wear it compared to the older Lena who used to buy from Zara or Mango or any one of those other brands. And I would wear some of those items once or twice and then get bored of them and toss them. And so if you actually do the math and think about the price associated with something that is made ethically and divide that by the amount of times that you're going to use it, compared to something from a Zara and dividing it by one or two, some of these dresses, I remember going to weddings and I would just buy this dress and wear it because I can't show it again. I can't wear it again because people have already seen me in that dress. And if you think about that math, it's actually it's supposed to be worth so much more. But I think in the moment, people just see the price tag and they compare it to the cheaper alternative. And they're like, oh, well, no, I should get the cheaper option. I guess like it's hard to help explain that to somebody, but like if you, from like your just experience with Zero Waste Palestine and how you produce content and help people kind of understand the work that you're doing and why it matters, what might you tell someone who is kind of at this point in time where they're like debating between, you know, a handmade dress or a handmade item that takes a lot of time and that person is paid equitably compared to the things that are kind of put on Instagram and through so many different ads? How might you help them like just have a just pause before they make a purchase? Is there anything that you might tell them that you think would go a long way?
I think that like the core issue, the root cause is this, you know, the consumption mindset and the consumption pattern that exists in society. The example that you just gave, that's okay, for every special occasion we wear one dress, but we cannot be seen in it again, so we'll need to buy another one. So that is a typical way of thinking when it comes to clothing and consumption. So it makes us believe, or it pushes the consumer to buy fast and cheap because they know that they're not gonna wear it again or like many times. And usually the advice that I give when it comes to buying clothes is like, okay, think about this piece consciously. How do I really need this piece, firstly? And secondly, if I need it, how many times am I gonna wear it? Is it gonna last, you know, some months, or is it gonna last years? What is the material made of? Is it something that's you know, is something that is wearable many times? So these kind of questions. But I feel that these kind of questions, they work for people that want to make a shift somehow, or that it helps people that maybe are already aware of the impacts of fast fashion, that they want to change their behavior somehow. But probably doesn't work. I mean, for if you're someone that is very much into this, you know, pattern of consumption, the consumption society, and it's difficult to break from that because we're so much part of it, and it's difficult to make that shift, I feel. So yeah, I feel that's I mean, showing us stories, for example, of how much time and energy it takes to produce certain things, how much for example, water that is put in making clothes in some ways, what is the impact on the workers that are producing these kind of things, and so on. But I feel that there is no one size fits all. Like, it's very the message that you craft and create is very, it differs a lot based on where you're at in the consciousness, or in your beliefs, and so on, and priorities as well. I mean, this is not a priority for many people, so yeah, it's I feel it's a bit difficult to give one answer, but I feel that stories is a great tool to kind of show or make people rethink and revalue things, maybe.
For people listening who, maybe I think a lot of us, especially since October, have really, with all the boycotts, have really started thinking about how we spend our money, which I think is a really great step to open people up to this type of lifestyle, if you will. But what would you say are some easy, tangible action items that people can start implementing in their lives to get closer to this idea of zero waste?
So I feel that it's knowing that this lifestyle is very much connected to a healthier lifestyle and a more economic one, like a financially sustainable one, gives an extra push into wanting to engage in these practices. Because yes, it's about the environment primarily, but it has so many other benefits. So if someone is suffering from, so many people have reached out to me with skin rashes, for example, or skin irritations or problems. That is is resulting from different products that they use, commercial products, and even commercial clothing and hygiene products and so on. So shifting these, like going to more natural and local alternatives, for example, that are chemical free and chemical free and more organic and natural, it also makes them feel more make them more healthy and get rid of many like health issues and so on. But also it's a when it comes to boycott, for example, it's about values and about it starts being connected to a greater cause when you become aware of the impacts of the big corporations and impact of capitalism on the world, basically, and how much it's tied to occupation and colonialism. So I feel that it's great that people are actually talking about these kind of things, that it's a topic of conversation, that finally people become aware of it. I think the danger here is that you go to, boycotted products, that you go to alternatives that are the same, but just like a local brand. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're healthier. But I still feel that there is, a shift somehow, to some extent, going on in being aware of, the consequences on our lives, on everyone, on the world, and in our lives and the environment. So.
Do you have any recommendations on how to evaluate whether a company is ethical or sustainable? I know a lot of them, it's becoming like a hot topic to include on their website, for example, how many carbon emissions are produced through their process of creating these garments. But do you have any, are there any considerations that you think about if you were to purchase from a mainstream or just like a bigger type of company that sells clothing?
When it comes to clothing, greenwashing is a very big thing when it comes to, businesses in general. When a big fast fashion brand suddenly creates a sustainable line or organic clothing line, that's a big warning sign, because, okay, they are doing something good on one hand, but it's also, what about everything else that they are still continuing with? They're still continuing with business as usual. So that is a typical greenwashing thing. So I feel that it's super important to be aware of how the origins of how a piece of clothing was produced. Is the company disclosing or talking about its suppliers, for example? Are they being transparent about the conditions of the factories, like where the garment comes from, how it's being produced, and so on? So I think transparency is number one, very important in order to achieve sustainability in that sense. And yeah, being aware of the trends of greenwashing and typical example of how companies greenwash can help you identify if this is something really sustainable or not. But I think that a rule of thumb is that do not trust, the typical big fast fashion brands, even though they have a sustainable line. That's usually just a cover-up, I feel.
I feel like this can also be applied when people are shopping for Tatreez, especially when you're shopping for Thwab. There's, of course, handmade, there are machine made, there are tons of companies and brands out there, some that say that they help and pay equitable salaries, but you have to really do your digging because that's not necessarily always the case. And I think to earlier conversation, like when we talk about Tatreez specifically, when we talk about Thwab, and traditionally, and like these women would spend so much time creating these Thwab, and they would wear them, and they would wear them for years and years and years, and change out panels as they needed to. And really, it was a very sustainable piece of clothing. And that's why, again, there is so much value in it. You talked a lot earlier about how you saw Tatreez as this like very expensive thing, and there's a reason for that. You know, we know, us who stitch know, and those who admire Tatreez and truly understand the time and passion and dedication it takes to create these garments. So I think it's important to take what you're talking about greenwashing and how you evaluate these larger companies to also do that with the trees. Because, you know, it's totally fair and it's totally reasonable to employ a ton of embroiderers to create the clothing that you're making if you have a brand, but it's also important to understand that the people that you are employing are being treated fairly, are being paid fairly. And, you know, I think it brings more pride into the clothing that you wear too, and you know that you can stand by it.
Yeah, definitely. And it's sad that this responsibility usually lies on the individual or the consumer, because that shouldn't be the case. But I think the more we ask and show the brands that this is something that is important to us and that we want, then they feel that this is not something that we can get away with all the time. So, you know, the more we show that this is important and this is valuable to us, then hopefully it can lead to a shift at companies or for businesses and brands. Yeah, and you mentioned also the commercial Tatreez that are done by machines. So I see that usually in shops, both in Palestine and Jordan, there's many shops that sell it for quite cheaply, you know, the different thobes that are machine made. And you can see that it's not you can see that it's not the original one. You can see somehow by the soul, by its energy, that this is just done, you know, like anything, and sold cheaply. So I feel that on one hand, it's good that more people have access to Tatreez in order to preserve the Palestinian identity. But on the other hand, it's also making it more, you know, fast fashion style, which
It's
is
cheapening.
totally against, it's totally against that whole idea of, you know.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's really interesting to talk with you about this world of zero waste, because it's not something, I mean, I live in California, so it's not something that I haven't heard of or been exposed to. But really talking to you about the trees in relationship to zero waste, it's really interesting. And like the little wheels in my brain are definitely turning as I think about, you know, my own wardrobe. And you know, what can I do to revive things and maybe incorporate the trees more into the stuff that I already have. This is really a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I really think this is probably the beginning of this type of conversation, because I think
Yeah.
it is so critical to start thinking through a lot more intentionally and with like objectives, you know, hopefully. But in the meantime, Najla, it was such a pleasure having you. I'm curious to learn more about what you're working on now. So I heard there's an ebook coming out sometime soon.
Yes, I'm working on an ebook that collects different recipes and ways and methods that they used to do in Palestinian heritage, and still do, of course, that are basically zero waste. So it's going to be called Zero Waste and My Palestinian Grandparents, or My Palestinian Ancestors. So basically a collection of recipes, both for the, you know, from the kitchen, bathroom, hygiene, clothing, and as a way to also preserve these methods and these ways, but also to reclaim the narrative that living environmentally conscious or zero waste or sustainably is not a Western concept, but something that has existed in our heritage for a long time. So that will be out this fall, inshallah.
That's amazing.
Inshallah, I cannot wait. That sounds amazing. And I love what you just said. Like, you know, I always joke around, because I'm from San Francisco, because I'm from California. I joke around about like the granola aspect of life here, But what you just said, like, this isn't necessarily a quote unquote white concept or a Western concept. It was very much like it wasn't even a concept. It was just a way of life for our ancestors.
Yeah.
It got conceptualized because of colonialization. So I'm very, very excited. And I believe you have a part in the book about clothing and Tatreez, correct?
Yeah, of course. Of course, because also apart from Tatreez, the way that Palestinian women used to dress in the old times is very sustainable because they usually just owned one dress or one thobe for the house and the housework, and then another one for special occasions. So it's literally, yeah, a very sustainable way of, they didn't have the means to buy more or make more, of course, but just that idea and way of dressing is very much very sustainable. So we could draw a lot of inspiration from that.
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting also to dive even deeper into the materials that are used as well, like comparing what a thobe is made out of today versus 100 years ago or so. Because, I mean, Amani and I were just in Amman, we went to Taraz, and we saw these dresses that are some of them are from 1910. And they're still so vibrant. Like they're still, like the colors are very vivid. The stitching is gorgeous. The fabric is still holding together. Like, sure, there is some wear and tear here and there, but I mean, they've been around since 1910 and there's bound to be something, and they were still used. So I would love to like learn more about the actual materials, because before, 100 years ago or so, they made them to last longer, just like you said, because they had so few pieces to wear. They intentionally did that. I mean, whether or not they knew it was, environmentally conscious was one thing, but they did do it with the intention of lasting. And I think that's the mindset shift that I think a lot of us, at least as Palestinians, like we're responsible to learn a little bit about that. So I'm really excited to see the ebook and where like the conversations it opens and opportunities it creates. Super excited about that.
Yeah. Okay. And one last question. I know you do not practice Tatreez yourself, but you are in relationship with Tatreez. So, what is so far the biggest life lesson that you have learned from Tatreez?
I think the slowness of the practice. The slowness, the idea of giving time and energy and love into creating something that becomes so beautiful and so valuable for people. So embracing this idea of slowness, which is quite difficult to have in this fast-paced world and in this capitalistic and system and society that is pushing so many new trends and consumption, mindsets basically to people that kind of stresses up our system internally, whether we're conscious of it or not. So yeah, I think that Tatreez gives a great life lesson of embracing this idea and the beauty of slowness.
I love that answer. That is a beautiful answer. Thank you so much for joining us. We have loved chatting with you. Before we let you go, can you let our listeners know where they can find you and learn more about all the work that you're doing?
Yes, of course. So either on my website, zerowastepalestine.com, or Instagram, Zero Waste Palestine.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We cannot wait for the book. We will let our listeners know when it's out because we will be purchasing it. Yes. I already know. Thank you, Najla. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
I'm so glad we finally got Najla on the podcast because it's interesting. Before I quit my full-time job at MasterCard, we have this woman who she leads the head of sustainability at MasterCard, okay, or like she has some sustainability role. And she asked me to do this like internal employee, like highlight an employee kind of thing from a sustainability angle. So when she first told me that, I thought she wanted me to talk about the work that I was doing with sustainability, because I did have a project that I was working on that was related to sustainability. And it turned out that the interview that was all about my own practices with sustainability as like an individual outside of my work experience. And all the questions that they were asking me, every single one, I had to talk about Tatreez. But I did not make the connection until that interview happened. And then when I read like the full, like my answers, I was like, oh my God, Tatreez is my gateway to living a more sustainable life. It's my gateway to understanding what sustainability actually is and not necessarily associate it with this like big picture, you know, removing carbon emissions, all this type of thing, like from such a macro level that felt so like, I guess, inaccessible to me as a person. And so I'm really happy that we got Najla on this podcast because I really do believe Tatreez is tied to solving the climate crisis that we're in right now. And I think it can be everyone else's gateway. It can make this idea of acting and living more sustainably, more accessible, at least within our realm of Tatreez practitioners. So I'm actually very excited that she was on here, and I hope that we have more conversations about this because I think we're just barely scratching the surface.
Well, I think it goes back to what I had referenced earlier of like, you know, and you see this across like different communities, or people are talking about like ancestral practices and, you know, going back to these ancestral practices, and we're seeing like, oh, these actually like are very sustainable. They make sense. Like, for example, I'm in California. We have issues with wildfires. Our indigenous community used to have controlled fires. And like, you know, there's all these things. There's reasons why like these people have been, you know, these people as in ancestors from all over the world have been living on this land for centuries and been passing down like, yeah, I mean, we're corporate, or you're, I guess, a former corporate girl. Like as a corporate girl, I can say we've taken the key learnings from our ancestors and implemented them. But like,
which is a good first step, but like,
but that's like kind of what, like, why have we abandoned? I mean, we know why we've abandoned it. But you know, it is nice to think and start seeing, even though it is slow, people are taking notice of this and are kind of going back to you know, these ancestral practices that make sense. And I, you know, one thing that Najla had said that I appreciate as well is, you know, she mentioned the fact that a lot of times this stuff is the burden is unfairly put on the consumer. And that is true. I will say, like, I work in the consumer product goods space, so I know these things. I don't want to get fired, so I'm going to say it. I'm not saying. But I will say that, you know, I understand this like I understand that the responsibility should be falling on the companies. That is not always the case. That's actually never the case. And I think that one thing to remember as a consumer, that I hope I say this to like make people more comfortable with the idea and not make it feel so overwhelming. You as a consumer, you as an individual, yeah, you can only do so much. Like, let's be honest, like you as an individual, you are not going to solve climate change. But you have to remember you're one piece of a very large puzzle. And when you and your neighbor and your neighbor's neighbor and your friend and your cousin and this and that and your entire community, when these like individuals come together to form community, companies do pay attention. You know, I, for example, have been in the beauty industry for, I'm not going to age myself and tell you how long, but I've been in the beauty industry for a long time. And I remember when quote unquote clean beauty was this novelty, where nowadays there is a bare minimum standard. You know, still got a long way to go. But you know, like the consumer mindset shifts, and that forces companies to shift. I think we see it with the boycotts. I think we see it with, you know, Tatreez and other hand embroidery arts, and sewing and things like that, especially after COVID, when everyone got like shut down and forced home. Like you started seeing people do for themselves. And I think started appreciating these things more, whether it was like making, I know the craze is like making sourdough bread. Or like making sourdough bread, or learning to sew, or learning the Tatreez and starting to create your own things. You do gain this appreciation, and you do start to see like, oh, I can do this for myself. And because it does take some time, you have that appreciation and you don't want to spoil it, if you will.
Exactly. No, and I think that point about tuning back into ancestral traditions and how, like, literally one of the the way that Najla describes her ebook is that it's all about how our Palestinian ancestors lived in alignment with nature. And that's 100% true. And it's for me personally, it's never more evident than when I practice Tatreez and like my own experience making my thobe. And yeah, I think there's like this, I think life is a pendulum, right? And we've shifted to one angle where it's like pure capitalism and crazy consumption and all this. And now, because of all the things that are at play, COVID, the genocide in Gaza, like all of these things are small. They're not small, but they're small attacks, I guess. Yes, exactly. So we're swinging the other way. And it's so funny because we're swinging like towards something that already existed. It's not like we're recreating this. It's something that's been there for centuries, but we forgot for a little bit.
And we have to reframe it for our current lives. And, it is not an overnight thing by any means. But I think, again, pointing to the boycotts since October, I think it's just like a little glimpse of like what we as a global community can do and change minds. So I'm excited for her book. We will definitely let you all know when that is available. But thank you so much for listening to Tatreez Talk. As always, we want to hear about your own Tatreez journeys. Share your stories with us at tatreeztalk@gmail.com, and we might have you on an upcoming episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite listening platform, and be sure to leave us a 5-star review. Do not waste our time with anything other than a 5-star review. You can follow me at Min Amani and Lina at Lina's Thobe, and of course, follow the podcast at Tatreez Talk. We'll talk to you soon.